Auditorium, it's a new sound system. Can you hear me? Yes! How long has it been since everybody in the hall was able to say yes to that question? You know, probably forever. So excited to be here. With me on the far left, as always, is my good friend Stephen Sanders. I'm Chris Mann, and everybody, to their detriment, knows that now. In between us, though, is a gentleman you might not know. Nolan Stolz is the music department chair at USC Upstate. Is the composer of one of this evening's pieces, and is also a nationally recognized expert on the music of Black Sabbath. So, you'll be glad to know there are no bats on stage today, so we won't be encouraged to do anything really unseemly. But I thought it would be interesting to have a chance to, for Nolan to tell us a little bit about this piece that we'll be hearing. So, to throw it out in the most general way possible, tell us about the piece.
It is a 5-movement suite, and tonight you'll hear the 5th or first movement. It's inspired by the Lincoln Highway, which was the first cross-country highway in the United States, 1913, New York to San Francisco. And we're doing the 5th movement, Golden State Romp, which represents the highway as it goes through California. That's assuming you perform the piece westward. But you could also perform it eastward, movements 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So the movement really works as an opener or as a closer. Tonight's program, it's functioning as an opener. The piece isn't trying to sound like it was written in 1913. It's a modern piece, but it's more of representing the landscape of that, what you would see when driving that highway.
So the notion of, I actually had not even realized myself that it was potentially the first movement as well as the 5th movement. Did that idea, was that in your head at the moment you sat down to write the piece, or was that something that as you kind of got into it, you went, hey, wait a minute, I got it?
Oh, yes. I started with the 3rd movement. I drove the Lincoln Highway across Iowa and Illinois. And,
who's this guy? Hold on. We've got, the stage has been crashed. Who is that? How did this guy get on stage? Who is this person? Anyway. This is Béla Fleck, ladies and gentlemen. I gather you were having dinner at the Piedmont Club, and I presume that second dessert was a bit toothsome. But so glad you're here.
I don't want to interrupt what you guys are talking about. Please finish.
Okay, so you were halfway through telling us about the sort of the design of this piece.
Right. I started with the composing the 3rd movement, as I was in that part of the country, and then I was thinking about the form of the whole piece and how it could work both ways. So the 1st and 5th movements, the outer movements would have to be functioning as either opener or closer, and the harmonic transitions between the 1st and 2nd, the 4th and 5th would have to work. And in the 3rd movement is the slow, open prairie view movement that works as a central movement.
So tell us basically, or I shouldn't say basically, but tell us what it is, some of the things that maybe we should be listening for tonight. Because the thing about being a composer in 2020 is that you can write everything. You can write anything. There's this entire, we've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years worth of history and tradition that we can mix and match and mash around as we see fit. Composers nowadays are working with everything from pop materials to neo-Baroque, neo-Renaissance, to high modernism. So there's all kinds of kind of musical possibilities. What were you working with as you wrote this piece?
There is a little bit of all of that in the piece, actually. In the fifth movement, though, there's no high modernism. I saved that for the fourth movement. But I guess what to listen for is the energy of the piece, and that represents San Francisco, just the city itself, bustling, lots of movement. And then you hear these sort of soaring melodies. You hear in the oboe, the clarinet, solo horn, and that represents the more pastoral views, say, between San Francisco, or rather Sacramento and Reno, let's say, that sort of rural, mountainous California. So if you could sort of picture this driving on a small, 2-lane highway going through the mountains, that would be what to listen for, I suppose.
That sounds like a pretty evocative image for us to work with tonight. So maybe at this moment, should we turn to the other composer in our midst here, Béla Fleck? Yeah, so Béla, most of us by this point in SpARTanburg are familiar with Béla Fleck. He's been a musical pioneer working across genres for decades now, 35 years. Let me turn the same question to you in terms of you had the whole world of possibilities. How did you kind of settle on your own musical materials for the Juno Concerto?
Well, that's the trick with every piece, is what's the language of this piece. It's like I feel like a good piece obeys certain rules. It is this and it's not that. I mean, in a way, you have to cut out most of what's possible to decide what your piece is going to be, what the language is going to be. Because you could do anything, like you said. You could write super abstract, you could write super tonal, you could be super rhythmic, you could be really simple, you could be pastoral. So in my case, I just try to find some germs that I'm really excited about, and then try to figure out how to grow a whole field of ideas that'll work together. And then as I'm assembling the piece, well, let me put it this way. I have a good friend who I really respect his composing. He's a guy named Edgar Meyer, great bass player, but also I think he's a really cool composer. And he always says, put off actually putting the piece together as long as possible. Like, search for materials as long as you can possibly do it, and put off that moment of, because once you start putting it together, you're going to make it work with what you've got. But if you've really got, like I said, like grown a field of ideas all based around something, you've got a lot more to work with when you're finally putting it together. And I know there are guys, and maybe you're one of them, who can imagine a piece, Mozart style, where you're just writing feverishly down. I'm a poser. I mean, I'm not a composer, I'm a poser. So I just love it, and I'm a dilettante, I guess you could say. I don't have a prayer of ever being, a Mozart or a Beethoven, but if I'm lucky and I can be myself really good, then that's the only way I can win. So I try to use music that really appeals to me, and I am selfish about it, and then I do the amount of complexity that I think makes sense, and try and do, and Edgar's other advice was show off the banjo, and I think he was saying, you're not going to be a great composer, but if you play really good and you have a lot of good banjo playing in it, then the piece will win anyway. So I always tried to take his, he also said, end with a fast movement. I was like, well, can't I end with a little beat? No, end with a, so I try to take his advice to some extent. That's a piece of what I was thinking.
So to some extent, I would expect the banjo itself kind of determines something about the melodic material, for instance, in the piece?
Well, absolutely. The banjo sort of compels you to write in certain ways because of the tuning. But I also will say I was trying very hard to avoid an Appalachian concerto, because that's the first thing people think. If anything, I wanted it to not be that for that very reason, because one of the things I love to do with the banjo is surprise people with what it can do that they don't expect. And so sometimes I avoid the obvious, foolishly, that would really work well. But usually by the time I'm finishing up a piece like this, and I'm starting to get a little frantic, that's when I go to the three-finger roll as fast as I can, because that really works. And that's what I did in this case. When it was time to finish up the piece and the clock was ticking down, I was like, you gotta finish this. I was like, I better play fast in G, So I did. I don't know if I answered your question.
So, yeah, it does, and it brings up a couple of other interesting questions, and one of them is, what were the circumstances under which you wrote this? Was there in fact a deadline, and this thing has to be in the mail by September 17th, or something like that? And it was September 15th, and you're...
Right. Well, I've been lucky enough to be commissioned to write pieces, and of course you always think they're going to go quicker than they are. So inevitably there's a point where you're like, wow, the orchestra's demanding, they're like, we want to see that, not everyone does that, but most orchestras, you commission something, there's a due date when they want to see the piece, even if it's 3 months before the premiere. And that's really wise. But in terms
if
of...
nothing else, it's an artificial deadline, I suppose.
Yeah, because
demand it 3 months in advance, then you can be a month late, but you've still got time to learn the piece.
So the first piece that I wrote, this is my second banjo concerto we're going to play tonight. The first one was called The Imposter. I should have called it The Poser. But, and that one, I really didn't know what I was doing very much at all. But Edgar and I had co-written 2 different concertos where he was sort of the leader, and I supplied materials and commented, but he had the grand vision of where it was going, and he's really good at that. But now I needed to do one on my own that was really a standalone banjo concerto, not a double concerto. So I created that first one. Nashville Symphony commissioned it, and we did The Imposter, and it went pretty good, but it was a hard piece for the orchestra to play, so not knowing what I was doing, I wrote things that were foolishly hard, that we spent a lot of our precious rehearsing time trying to get, so we didn't get to really play the piece at rehearsals, and we would always be down to the wire trying to get through, and then it would always work out. It always worked out really well, but it was too much of a nail-biter for me. But for some luck, or because of my being known outside of the classical world, I got a lot of performances, something like 50 performances. And so what began with me feeling really alien and odd to be in the middle of an orchestral situation, by the end of a couple of years, it was kind of normal for me to, this weekend I'm going to play, with this symphony or that symphony. And then in the process of it becoming normal, I figured maybe my brain was getting used to what all the instruments were supposed to do, what was hard for the orchestra, what mistakes I had made in writing the first piece. I wouldn't really take back any of the notes, but there were, choices on who played what that could have been better. And so anyway, when I wrote the new piece, it was just, the idea was we were having a child, we were having Juno, our son Juno. This piece is called the Juno Concerto. And I was going to go off the road. I wasn't going to be touring. I was looking for things I could do without traveling so I could be a good parent. And one great idea was, and I probably wouldn't have written my second concerto so soon if it wasn't for this, but then this commission came up and they said, would you like, and I said, well, that's great because I can work on something at 4 in the morning. I can work at something anytime I want. I don't need a band to be waiting for for gigs. I don't need to travel. So that first summer I did a lot of the writing. We were petrified parents, so we watched them constantly because we had this thing they told us before we left the hospital about SID, sudden infant death, so that we were like, we're never going to take our eyes off this kid when he's sleeping for the first 5 years. And so which meant somebody was going to be sitting up at 4 in the morning, watching him. So that was a pretty good time for me to be like with my computer and he was asleep and I was working on it. So that was part of why I named it Juno, besides it being a good name for a concerto, I thought.
And I gather he's traveling with you nowadays, right?
He is, yeah.
And did he enjoy exploring the hall during rehearsal?
Yeah, he loves running around. Was that okay? Because we also have a 1.5-year-old now, and he loves to run around the hall, and it's a lot of fun while the orchestra is rehearsing to hear them running around, unless it's driving someone crazy, which is also possible. For me, it's sweet.
So you alluded to something a few minutes ago that I thought would be interesting to come back to, and that's the question of how do you put the thing together? That it sounds like your approach was that you accumulated chunks of music, and then what? Basically, how do you take your chunks of music and turn them into a concerto? How do you decide what to keep, what goes where? Right. Well, you might have some great input on this, but for me, when you're accumulating chunks of material and you're planning to write a piece, they kind of go together. I mean, it's not. You might think it's random, or I just happen to be coming up with this or that, but some part of your unconscious is pointing you in certain directions, and it tends. And when you have a writer or an artist who writes in a certain period, that music tends to go together. So I just think the other thing is you start to become infatuated with certain things. You go, well, I really like that. I really want that in the piece, whether it should be in it or not. And that's where it's hard when you're your own editor. But then you can do some backstory type stuff, like you go, well, I know this is the first movement. I know now I finally got my last movement, but now that I've got the last movement, it doesn't really tie in. Maybe I'll use take some framework from that last thing and use it as supporting lines in the first movement, or turn it into a bass line that's moving slowly under something else. And then I do some, last minute, not late, well, late in the game, I go try to make sure that the melodies are happening enough times and that they're being developed. And there's lots of tricky ways to sort of embed it into the underpinning of the piece.
And so at the very end, sometimes then I decide to write an introduction, or I add some extra stuff that I realize is missing.
This is actually a question for both composers. As you're kind of working with some of your material, do you find yourself inspired by the particular instrument that you're starting with? Like, for instance, if you're going and you're like, oh, I really want to have an oboe line here as kind of obligato, over top of the action. Does the oboe itself kind of dictate what that melodic material is, or are you more likely to have melodic material and then look at it and go, yeah, this would sound good in the oboe?
Yeah, I would say I would think of the instrument first and write for the instrument, as opposed to write a melody and say, ooh, what instruments would that fit its range? I don't think that way. I'd rather think, oh, I'm going to write a clarinet solo and then write it for that instrument, thinking about the various registers or whatever.
I do the other just again because of my lack of compositional training, and the only way I could write a piece like this is with the computer software that can play it back for me. Because also, like, Edgar will be laying on the floor writing the score on his stomach with a pencil, and I just can't hear the music when I look at the score, so I actually have to hear it back. And so I use the computer, and sometimes I just start humming along. I come up with a banjo part, for instance, or a bass line or something, and I start singing a line on top of it in my head till I find something that really fits with it. And once I do it, I just get it into banjo tablature, which I can write. I can't write very well for regular notation, but with Sibelius, this music writing program, you can write in banjo tablature, which is numbers, onto a banjo stave, copy it and paste it, and boom, it just appears in notation on a violin or a bassoon or whatever. And I've learned how to manipulate that very well and get what I'm after. So then if I find a melody and I can manipulate it to be in the right notes, then I'll just paste it onto some different staves and then I can imagine, even from the crappy sounds in that computer, I can imagine now with my limited experience with an orchestra what ought to be on a bassoon or what ought to be on a bass clarinet, or what should be an oboe line or a clarinet line or a flute line. And I keep trying it, and then it works better than you would think. You get a little bit, you hate the sounds when you hear the real guys playing it, men and women playing it. It's a revelation and it's a joy, but you always will miss the rhythmic accuracy of the computer. So you have to remember real people aren't going to do that. If you write too rhythmically based on what the computer can do, you're going to have trouble. So it's all a learning curve for me. Yeah, well, it's 80 people that can't hear each other properly without this. This is the fact, and everybody's trying to hang together, but you're the only one who actually is hearing it all the way it's supposed to be. It's a very tricky algorithm. In other words, a 4-piece band, you're all right next to each other, or a string quartet, or a bluegrass band, you're right next to each other and you can hear each other. You're not trying to connect with somebody who's 60 feet away from you. So the referee comes in really handy.
We, just so you realize, you see these big speaker-looking things in the back of the orchestra. Those are essentially speakers, so the back of the orchestra can hear Béla. So we cheat a little bit, because it is very difficult on many stages to be able to hear across the orchestra, or even from front to back. So with a hyperrhythmic piece like some of Béla's music, being able to hear the banjo constantly playing this running rhythm is a great help. So
they're not just going by that; they can use their musical wherewithal and not just follow orders. They can actually have a little bit of free will, to connect.
Not too much free will, mind you.
But the banjo's too soft, and it's very directional. So if I'm sitting up here facing forward, and we weren't amplified, you would hear a little bit of it, but you wouldn't hear much. So similar to a classical guitar playing a concerto, you really want to have a mic on it, and we try and do it in as earthy and natural way as possible with a really rich, natural-sounding microphone. And we put a little bit of it back there so that the orchestra can hear some of what I'm doing. If you're playing piano concerto, no problem, right? You're going to hear the piano. Violin, pretty much too, because they're standing up and the sound travels. But the banjo is very directional.
So let's talk for a moment, if we will, about Copeland's Avalanche in Spring, which is the other piece on the program tonight, which is something that all musicians are really going to know.